everybody, Questwise here. Welcome to the Ages and Empires channel. This is a offshoot channel of the main Questwise channel, where I'm going to talk about history, historical gaming, and its impact upon the gaming world at large, the tabletop gaming world at large. Today I want to talk about Gary Gygax in a video that I'm going to be calling the Gygaxian Legacy. And that is that Gary Gygax, before he had created D&D, had actually worked on a number of historical games. In particular, the one I'm going to be talking about today is Alexander the Great. This was originally published by Gygaxian Games and later picked up by Avalon Hill. And we'll take you down to the table in a few minutes and I'll show you the game board and how that's sort of laid out. I'm not going to do actually any gameplay today, but I kind of want to show you the original sort of hex encounter board war game that was created by Gary, and which would later lead into such things as Chainmail, which is the Rules for Medieval Miniatures by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. We'll talk a little bit about this at the table as well. And that particular game, which had a fantasy supplement that would later lead to the original Dungeons and Dragons. Now, these are the PDFs that I purchased from DriveThruRPG. They're the sort of updated versions of them and had them printed out and bound for my personal use, which would later lead into things like Greyhawk at large in the wider world of Dungeons and Dragons itself through whatever edition. This is from the most recent 5th edition book, but there was a Greyhawk supplement for the original Dungeons and Dragons as well, and became a big part of 1st edition Dungeons and Dragons, 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons as well. But I just want to talk a little bit about how the impact that Gary had upon the world of wargaming, and to fully understand the aspect that Gary and his crew, his group of friends, who all eventually created Chainmail, including Jeff Perrin and many others. Dave Arneson, I'm trying to think of all of them. There's quite a group of them who created what would become Dungeons and Dragons. Originally began as a group of tabletop wargamers, and that being either hex encounter wargames, which we'll take a look at the Alexander game today at the table, as well as miniature wargaming, which is what Chainmail seeks to implement. So in I believe it was 1974, Gary Gygax worked with a company called Gygaxian Games, in which he designed this Alexander the Great board war game, a hex encounter war game, which I like to refer to as bits and chits, and we'll see that in a few minutes. It was later, again, once Gygaxian Games went bankrupt, Avalon Hill picked up this game and published it. I purchased this used copy from Noble Knight Games. It was already punched. It was a used game, of course. Obviously, it's out of print. All the counters were there. They weren't clipped. If you are a board war gamer, if you understand that concept of clipping counters, none of these were clipped, and I don't think that they need to be. And I'll show you what's kind of interesting about the board and the counters that Gary had come up with for this particular game. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about Chainmail and how Chainmail sort of grew out of that, and how you can see a lot of similarities, and some of the projects that I'm working on currently to sort of blend the two, to sort of take Chainmail into a realm of a hex encounter type war game. So if you don't mind, join me down at the table and we'll take a look at the Alexander board war game. So here we are back down at the table in the game room basement of Questwise. We're going to be taking a look at the Alexander the Great board game to begin with. I am filming this with my handheld camera, so it might be a little bit shaky, so please, I apologize for any of that. Here's the board. In the 70s, when this was created, a lot of people were sort of off-put by the colors on the board. I've heard it referred to as an acid vomit trip. Some of these colors are really interesting. So we've got some browns and some pinks and some greens and some blues. In all reality, it never really bothered me that much. But it really kind of off-put some people, as opposed to some of the other games that were put out at the time by like Avalon Hill, sort of like a Bull Run or Fortress Europa. This board was much more colorful and a much more active, I guess, as it is in color. These colors do represent certain things. So the green and the blues are sort of open terrain. These browns and pinks and stuff consider like hills, mountainous regions in the back, and are considered difficult terrain. But I wanted to take a look at a couple of these counters and stuff today. So for instance, we have these sort of oversized counters, and these represent phalanxes in the Alexander the Great game, which makes sense because see if I can get this to focus in here. Which makes sense because, you know, the phalanxes were much larger units, and then you have some of these smaller units as well. So you can see the size difference between the larger counters and the smaller counters. Each of these counters represents a unit of men, of soldiers, and they do use the NATO designations for certain things. So these are archers, Macedonian archers. These are agrarian javelineers, and then we've got some more phalanx here as well. But zooming out a little bit, you can see the board as a whole. This is the recommended setup. You can see on the board it will actually tell you where certain things should be placed. There are rules within the rules manual, which is here, that talks about how you can do variant setups. Basically, anywhere behind this main line, you can set up your troops in any order that you wish. So, for instance, Alexander is currently here with his phalanx. I've played this game in which I've placed him over here with his royal companions, which in a lot of the battles he would ride with this heavy horse units. But in this particular battle, which this game sort of encompasses the Battle of Gaugamela, or the Battle of Arbela, which I believe it was known by as on the Persian side. I do not have the Persian side set up. It would be over there beyond where the box is at there currently. I just wanted to show you a brief setup of what the Macedonian side looked like with all of its various units and allies on the table as well. But in this particular battle, Alexander did apparently, and again, a lot of speculation here, a lot of sort of creative license on Gary Gygax's part, because we don't really, I mean, we have some accounts of this battle, but we don't have actual written orders of battle for all of these things. But it was thought that Alexander actually marched at the front of the line, as you can kind of see, with a phalanx in this particular battle. There are a few other game companies out there. GMT does the Great Battles of Alexander, which covers the 3 major battles that took place against the Persians with Alexander. And then as we sort of pan down over here, you can see that there's this really cool morale status gauge at the bottom of this. And I think this is what made this game really interesting. And what's really interesting about this morale gauge and sort of balancing this concept of your troops' morale, as opposed to sort of like just being outright destroyed, you see a lot of that sort of appear in chainmail. This concept of using morale on your troops, in addition to sort of being damaged or destroyed, reduced in effectiveness, you'll see a lot of that in chainmail as a morale factor, and whether or not your troops will stay in the battle or they'll retreat, and you have a chance to maybe rally them, on top of them maybe just routing completely and leaving the battlefield. So it's interesting to see that sort of crossover between early hex and counter war games, which Gary created, and then what Gary and Jeff Perrin worked on in chainmail, incorporating those morale ideas and concepts as well. Chainmail is really an interesting game. It is also extremely hard to understand. It's pretty obvious that when Gary worked with Gygaxian Games and working on this, he had an editor and he had some kind of a production team that helped him sort of like refine his ideas and make them a playable game. Chainmail, on the other hand, reads like a bunch of notes, just simply jotted down as they were playing, and can be a little bit difficult to understand at times. From my understanding, this was not, I mean, this was sort of like, there were other revisions of this done. I believe, if I remember right, this is the third edition of this game. But I think what Chainmail could have really used is a much better editor. The flow of reading this is very difficult. But again, not much different than a hex and counter game. As you can see, let me show you here in the rules, a lot of these rules as far as the basic games go, in most, and you'll see this mostly in a lot of hex and counter war games, is that they're written out much like a VCR repair manual. Now this one's not too bad. This one's actually pretty well edited and placed, in a much more readable fashion. But a lot of times you will see in hex and counter war games that we've broken down by like section 1A, 2A, 3A, that kind of thing, and reads much more like a repair manual than it does a actual rule book. So if you're a modern gamer and you're going back to explore some of these games like I am currently, especially with the Ages and Empires channel here, it's a bit of a learning curve, in sort of a retrospect aspect where you're going back in time and seeing how things were actually sort of the norm in the 70s and 80s. What I want to try to recreate, and something I've been working on for a while now, there is within Chainmail, this is meant to be a miniature tabletop war game set in the medieval era. And at the very back of this, you will see that there is a fantasy supplement. And it starts here on page 28. So we have the fantasy supplement of Chainmail, a sort of medieval skirmish type thing, where it's incorporating things like creatures like dragons and ogres and trolls and orcs and that kind of stuff. I have and always will be a fantasy nerd at heart. And while I really, really enjoy history, and I have studied history when I went off to university, Alexander the Great being one of my favorites, so it was a no-brainer to pick up Gary's first, creation as far as a hex and counter war game, because I not only am I a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, but also a fan of history. I wanted to sort of incorporate my love of both of these together. While I love miniatures, I'm not a real big fan of the way that miniature wargaming in the early days took place. I'm not a fan of counting out wheeling and forming of units, it sort of is tiresome to me. And I did my time doing that sort of things by playing Warhammer Fantasy Battles and Warhammer Historicals. I wanted to encapsulate the fantasy aspect of chainmail in a sort of hex encounter aspect of gaming. So I've begun production, and I don't know if this will ever be published or not, because, I mean, falls under, there's a lot of IP stuff, right? But I've begun designing hexes, or designing units or chits for a hex encounter or aspect of tabletop game using the chainmail rules. So here you can see I have a dwarven unit of armored foot. I have some orcs of a unit of heavy foot. But I'm also going to be integrating the idea of, which the fantasy supplement included, were hero figures or superhero figures, leader figures, which had a huge impact on the game. So I began to create these sort of small character cards for different heroes, and I plan on using exclusively Ral Partha miniatures. Now you can find these. There's a company called Ral Partha Legacy. Ral Partha Legacy, I believe that's what it's called. I'll put a link down below to their website. But they are a small company out of Ohio who have purchased all of the molds for the original figures, and you can now buy them. They have their own rule system of games that you can use for mass battles, but I plan on buying these to use as hero figures that will basically be put on the map, much like is shown here. So you would have your unit of figures as a counter, and any heroes that join those units would simply be placed on top as such. So you have a sort of 3D aspect to a hex encounter game, but it will only be for the heroic figures that will show the individual heroes on the battlefield at the time, where each one of these hexes, or each one of these counters, would represent, according to the fantasy supplement for chainmail, 20 infantry units. So this one hex, or this one chit right here, this one unit counter, would represent 20 orcs of heavy foot. And then you can do things like, stacking counters to make, I'm working on things like orcs will have a rule called the horde, which means that they can stack like 3 units high and add all their attack factors together as just one big horde of orcs coming at you within the same hex. And other aspects of dwarves maybe being able to form shield walls, have special abilities. Orcs can have special abilities based on the terrain factors and stuff as well. So a little something I'm working on just to sort of incorporate both the hex encounter war games that I love of the past with the chainmail rules, mostly as written by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. So just a quick look at the sort of early days of hex encounter wargaming and its influence into things like mass battle miniature rules, which would later become the game that we all know and love, Dungeons & Dragons, the role-playing game, which is a much more refined, sort of character-based game, in less of affecting things like units of men, but individual figures as a whole. So that's it for today's episode. Just a quick look at some of the things that I'm working on, as well as my love of things like chit and bit wargaming, as well as tabletop miniature gaming as well. So until next time, I'm Questwise, my friends. Please stay safe out there, and as always, game on.